my senior exit project, I decided to study the evolution of political parties. So the question I decided to research was, what are some repercussions to how the U.S. two-party political system has evolved throughout its course of history? In what ways, or is it even possible to change the system now? So I kind of chose this topic because history has always been of interest to me. This is a topic that naturally interests me, so I was really excited to do some thorough research about it. I'm also really into politics and hope to go into that one day, so that's another reason why I chose this topic. So to begin, to even start answering this question, I researched the Democratic political party and the Republican political party. I researched how representatives are chosen. I researched the process of gerrymandering and the history of political parties, which a lot of that was prior knowledge, so I added that into my paper. And I researched the media bias because that's a current issue that's affecting this topic right now. And it's what led me to do this project in the first place. Here's some slides about my research process, but before we get into that, I'm going to tell you why I decided to go with this topic. So it was around election season, and it was there was a lot of opinions going around because everyone had their candidate that they thought should be president, but in reality, everyone just kind of hated the other candidate and voted for the candidate they hated less. So it was the day after the election, after Donald Trump won the election, surprisingly, because the media outlets had been projecting that Hillary Clinton would win. Well, the other girls at my lunch table were crying and so upset. So I said one thing. I said, it's not the end of the world if Donald Trump is president. He has a couple of good policies. Maybe it'll even be good for the country. And I didn't get a thank you. I got a, well, your opinion's wrong. I didn't want to hear that. And it really offended me because my opinion's not wrong. I should be able to express my opinion, and so should other Republicans who were happy with the outcome of the election. But unfortunately, we can't do that because people are just very intolerant of others' opinions. So that's why I kind of wanted to get to the bottom of why people became so intolerant of other people's opinions, and maybe some reasons or when that started. So now I'm going to jump into what the major political parties are before I get into their history. So we've got the Republican Party, represented by the elephant. That came into being in the late 1800s, the Gilded Age, when the Republicans were really dominating the political scene. They won, from the time Abraham Lincoln won presidency, they lost only 4 elections until 1932. So the Republicans really were dominating. So cartoon artist Thomas Nast represented the Republican Party with the elephant because of its dominance. So the Republican Party is more conservative leaning. They go for conservative social policies, economic policies. They're really for a strong national defense, and they're lean towards pro-life stances, which gives them a lot of support from the churches and all of that. And they're good for deregulation. The Democratic Party, the opposition to the Republican Party, is represented by a donkey, and I couldn't really find why they chose the donkey. I think it was around the Jackson age is when they got the donkey, because a lot of people were anti-Jackson, so donkey, So, Democratic Party is liberal. They like the expansion of federal power by doing social initiatives. They're very socially liberal policies. They want to get rights for everyone and help people out. They're pro-choice, which gets a lot of support from the women. And they have a Keynesian economic policy, which is, okay, actually we're not going to go to that side yet. Now I'm going to dive into the history of the political parties. So we'll start where I'll begin. Back in the 1700s, when George Washington, right after George Washington's presidency, he announced his retirement in a pamphlet called Washington's Farewell Address. So the first thing he suggested was to not form alliances with other countries, kind of stay neutral. Big thing he made was do not form political parties. Washington warned against the forming of political parties because he thought that it would weaken and tear apart the nation that he had helped build. He didn't want to see this nation that was barely held together as it is so early in its days fall apart by differences supported by the political party system. Didn't really hold out, and that's pretty much right after Washington left office. Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr and a couple other people decided they didn't agree with the Federalists who had pushed the ratification of the Constitution, and they wanted to form their own party, more focused on states' rights and protection of their individual liberties. This was known as the Democratic Republican Party. This is really the origin of the Democratic Party. This is where it began, Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, so that's important to know. Next, well, the election of 1800 is very important. That was the first peaceful transfer of power between parties in the United States, and really all over the world, because the United States was the first modern democracy. So that really showed that this is, the democracy is working and the two-party system can be effective. So it went from Adams, a more federalist president, to Jefferson, a Democratic Republican. Everything turned out okay. The next part that's really important would be the election of 1820. This is around this time, after the War of 1812, the Federalists had kind of dissolved because they didn't really want to go into war with Britain in the War of 1812. So the Federalists got the reputation as British sympathizers, which was not a good reputation at the time. So that party kind of dissolved, and there was only one political party for a time during Madison's presidency. And this is known as the era of good feelings. Monroe ran completely unopposed in his elections and served 8 years in office. Then hit the election of 1824, and they were still kind of trying to do the one-party thing, but differences were becoming apparent. So there was 4 candidates on the election of 1824 ticket. It was John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, and Henry Clay. So divisions were coming apparent. A group aligned themselves behind Adams, a group aligned themselves behind Jackson, Crawford, Clay. Really, they could have formed 2 major packs. This really showed why the two-party system can be beneficial, because 2 major parties means that at least one person has to get a majority. If there's 4 candidates, not one party can really get a majority. Well, they can, but it probably won't be over 50% because the vote can be split in so many different ways. So Adams wins when Clay throws in the election in the House, because Adams and Jackson were the top 2. So it went to the House. So Jackson vows to win. He wants to beat Adams. This is where the process of mudslinging and trashing the other candidate and really hardcore campaigning that is prevalent among elections today began. Jackson started running probably the day after he lost. He went really hard at it, publishing all these different stories about Adams and why he wasn't fit for president, and Adams was throwing it right back, why Jackson's not fit for president. And this really kind of tore apart their families, and this really isn't a high point for the political parties, because it kind of starts a destruction, and the United States doesn't need that in its political system. And here also kind of formed the two political parties. The supporters of Jackson, known as the Jacksonian Democrats, kind of formed their own party. And Jackson wasn't exactly popular, so there was an anti-Jackson party called the Whigs, who their main purpose was just they hated Jackson. That was the reason for their whole party. So that was the 2 major parties of the time. This begins the age of the dominance of the Democratic Party. And after this, they would pretty much dominate up until the Civil War because of their big Southern support base. So now we get to the Civil War. And slavery issue is huge. Everyone has a different opinion. The North wants it abolished. The South wants to keep it because it would uproot their way of life. So this splits the Democratic Party into two factions, which really weakens the party. They have the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. And because of this, they kind of formed the Republican Party, which is born out of the anti-slavery movement. So to form the Republican Party, it was the Whigs that weren't doing so hot at the time, the Northern Democrats, and members of the Free Soilers Party, which was a party based solely on the abolition of slavery. These groups joined together in opposition to the Democrats, and they experienced very early success. Within 2 months of its creation, they already had House majority, which is saying a lot. Slavery was on the way out, but the South could not handle this. So they said, if a Republican gets elected president, we will secede. This is really the high point of partisanship, which I'll define now because I don't think I have yet. Partisanship is when the act of believing something so strongly that you neglect to believe the other side of the issue or following one party. So, following one party, so, I don't want to say blindly, but very believing in its ideologies that they completely do not listen to the other side of the issue, which can be problematic. So this is kind of what was going on in the South at the time. They did not want to hear any other opinions. They wanted slavery, and they were willing to fight for it, obviously. The first Republican president elected was Abraham Lincoln. And as I said earlier, from the time of Lincoln to 1932, the Republicans lost only 4 elections. So they were doing pretty well. Next big era of change in the political party system was the 1930s during the Great Depression, specifically FDR's presidency. FDR was really for the social initiatives to help bring up the economy out of the Depression. So with his New Deal program, he introduced programs such as Social Security and welfare. Also, this was kind of a short decline for the Republicans because FDR was so successful. I mean, he ran 4 terms, so he was pretty successful, and this also signified a switch of the African American voters from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party because they were getting more assistance from the government to support their way of life. The next main thing, this is kind of where I think the problems start. So I'll flip to the next slide. The problems really started probably the 1960s, when the television news outlets, when news was more readily available to the public and they could get the news whenever they wanted, either on the radio and with the introduction of the television, they could get news. With this introduction, this is kind of where the problems of media bias started to play in. And it's when the Democratic Party took on very liberal social initiatives with JFK's presidency. He pushed the Great Society platform, as did his successor Johnson, which which was all about civil rights reform and giving African Americans equal rights. So this is kind of where a big difference starts playing. The Republicans really had an opposition issue, and that's kind of where the parties, that's when partisanship really heats up, when there's a key issue that you can have strong support for or strong opposition for. So some of the main problems that I've found with the political system are media bias, partisanship, and public intolerance. First, I'll start with media bias. Media bias is a problem because that's where people get their information. Most people aren't going out of their way to look things up on the internet. They'll watch 5 o'clock news, and that's how they get their political intake for the day. That's how they know what's going on. They'll read the newspaper. But here's the thing. In a survey I found by a UCLA political science professor, they ranked all the major 20 news organizations for how liberal or conservative, see how middle of the road the news coverage was. And they found that 18 of the 20 major news outlets that they studied lean to the left. Now this is a really big, media bias towards the left. If the people are only hearing left-sided news, then how are they supposed to get the whole picture of what's actually going on? Really, that's what it comes down to. And the journalists can kind of use this against us. Like, and I know in the recent election, a lot of the news coverage towards the Republican candidate, Donald Trump, was very negative. Everything about him that the news outlets chose to show was not shedding him in a good light. So this kind of is where a big problem that came with the 2016 election was fake news. With all the major news outlets quoting anti-Trump material, the Republican voters kind of wanted something good. So there was kind of an increase in the demand for fake news. So these could be found on Facebook, Twitter, social media sites really. And they would pop up on your feed as news stories, but they weren't always true. They'd be ridiculous headlines that totally not relevant, that would show Trump in a positive light and Clinton in a negative light, or vice versa. And media bias is still very real. On several of my searches on the news websites that I was looking for my sources, there would be ridiculous headlines about Donald Trump is on the golf green, like, and he made his face, or something stupid like that, instead of covering why was he out there, or like, what is he doing in office, what is he doing that's affecting our country, the stuff that is actually relevant and that we need to know. Instead of focusing on the issues that the people need to know about, the news is covering small, insignificant details to shed Trump in a bad light. And that's really not fair to our president, who should be respected. This media bias also plays into partisanship really heavily, because if people are constantly hearing opinions from the left, they're going to be swayed to believe that, and they're going to believe in the left side more strongly. This is kind of like, if all they hear is the left, they're not going to believe anything from the right. They're going to totally disregard that and not form their own opinions. They're just going to form the opinions of whatever their major news outlet shows them. Which, as an educated country, this should not be the case. More people than ever are going to college right now, and with that college education, people should be more inclined to do the research themselves and look at the issues. The only problem is, even if they do that, there's so much media bias on the websites and on news outlets that you can't really get the whole side of the picture. In that same article by the UCLA political scientist, he said that you would have to watch equal amounts of Fox News and NBC World Report to get a pretty middle-of-the-ground experience with the news and know what's going on. Even celebrities or local celebrities, such as Josh Perry, has pointed this out. On Twitter, he kind of showed two snippets of the same story shown from CNN and Fox News. They were totally, same story, totally different angles. You could, so many facts can be turned one way and turned the other way. It's kind of scary how powerful these news outlets are, which is why we need to keep them in check. That's one of my calls to action, is for the media to become more moderate in their coverage and not lean so far in one direction. This can also help stop the public intolerance, because if people get a more well-rounded view of what's going on in the world, they'll be more open to hearing other opinions and won't be so fast to shut other people down when they don't want to hear what they have to say. This will also promote more unity in Congress, I think, because that'll make, if the people are more willing to agree and talk about the issues, then politicians will be as well. So maybe they could actually get some stuff done. Here. So on to my final statement. Overall, I think I really learned a lot about the different political parties and kind of actions we can take in the future. For example, I learned the process of gerrymandering and where the term originated. Gerrymandering is the process how representatives are chosen. So pretty much the legislative body will draw the districts in their states of how the representatives be allocated. This process can be skewed one way or the other, and the districts are kind of winner take all. And Democrats tend to gravitate towards cities, that's where the more liberal areas are, so it doesn't take up as much square yardage as the Republican Party, which has a rural base or a suburban base. That covers a lot more area, which can win them a lot more seats in this process. But one of the problems is that I found in one of my articles was that what if you're a Republican in New York City, which is very liberal? You're not getting your voice heard because New York City is always getting the Democratic leaders elected to the Congress. This is, so pretty much it's saying your opinion doesn't matter. Your rights aren't being fighted for. What you need isn't a concern to the Democrats who are pushing their own agenda. So one of the proposed solutions was making multi-member districts. So it would combine like 5 or 6 of those small little weird shaped districts drawn through the process of gerrymandering to make a big district that would have 5 or 6 representatives. So they would the vote would kind of be split. So if there's 5 representatives, 4 could go to the Democrats and 1 could go to the Republicans. This would kind of create a more balanced Congress, and it would give everyone the feel that they had a say in the government. And if you had a Republican elected from like New York City, they would have a different opinion than a Republican elected from Texas. So it would bring more discussion and bring more sides to the issue so that the problems in America can be more thoroughly resolved, and we can really promote some good discussions so we can solve problems. And if we have a more diverse Congress, it'll support the diverse country that we have. I think overall I really enjoyed this project. I think it was helpful in learning about how the system works and kind of revisiting the roots of where big things started to happen in the government that kind of led us to the problems they have today. And it gave me hope for like what we can accomplish in the future. A lot of us will be 18 this school year. We'll be able to vote. We need to take this into our own hands and educate ourselves more thoroughly on the issues. If we start now educating ourselves on the issues, it translates to us educating ourselves on the issues later in life. And we can teach our kids to educate themselves on the issues. And eventually, maybe we'll be a more educated public. Maybe we'll get a full spectrum on the issues, and we can decide what's right based on our own opinions and not the opinions of our parents, neighbors, news outlets, teachers, anyone else really. You need to form your own opinions. So that's what I'm calling everyone to do before they go to the polls in November. Thank you.